guys, today we are talking about aggregate demand. And remember, we learned the definition for aggregate quite a bit ago. Aggregate means everything added together. So all of the entire demand in the country added together. And just like when we talked about regular demand in microeconomics, like my demand for a good or everybody in Lawrenceburg's demand for a good, it's larger scale now. We're looking at macroeconomics. And just like regular microeconomic demand, outside forces will change the curve. It'll shift it left or right, okay? So aggregate demand, we're going to abbreviate it with AD, is all of the demand added together nationwide. So the demand for all goods and all services. We're not looking at individual markets. We're not looking at individual goods. We're looking at absolutely everything. So it shifts left if it decreases. Remember, left means less. And then sometimes that's called a demand shock. So if you ever hear me say demand shock, that means that we're shocking the demand. It's going backwards. It's decreasing. Or right if we're increasing on the graph. And so aggregate demand is much like GDP. GDP measures our output. Aggregate demand measures how much we want of those goods that are in the output, okay? So it's actually made up of the same things that GDP is made up of. So C, consumer spending, I, investment spending, G, government spending, and X, net exports, which is exports minus imports, okay? And the reason, again, that it's made up of the same thing that GDP is made up out of is because it's the demand for absolutely everything in the United States, all the things, all the goods and services. So it matches GDP because GDP is all the goods and services we make, and then AD measures how much people demand those goods and services, okay? So here's an example of it. So here is the regular AD curve, and if it decreases, it goes to the left. Left is less, and we would label it AD2. If it increases, it goes to the right, AD1, okay? But our X and Y axis are different on this graph. Before it was price over here and quantity over here. But now, since we're looking at absolutely all the goods and services demanded in the United States, they're going to be different. The y-axis right here is going to be price level, and another way of saying that is inflation, so I'll use those interchangeably. And as it goes up, this would be a low price, and up here would be a high price. So as it goes up, that means that the price of all goods, we're not looking at individual, we're looking at aggregate, the price of all goods goes up or it goes down, okay? And then down here on the x-axis, we have our GDP, real GDP. So GDP once inflation has been taken out. And another word for that is output. So if you hear me use the word output, I mean the real GDP. And again, down here, the output wouldn't be very much. Up here, it increases quite a bit. So this is less down here, and this is more up here. And let's talk very quickly here. So if we have more output, more GDP, more stuff being made, that means we're going to have lower employment on this end of the graph, right? And if we have less stuff being made over here, remember, pretend there's like numbers here. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So these numbers are lower. If we're making less stuff over here, that means we're going to have higher unemployment because people aren't making stuff. That means people don't have jobs. So output, as it increases, unemployment decreases. And output, as it decreases, unemployment increases. So if AD shifts this way, then we're making more stuff than when we were here. So our GDP increased and our unemployment decreased, okay? If if AD shifts this way to this curve, we were here, but now we're here, our GDP has decreased and thus our unemployment has increased, okay? Because we're making less stuff, so we're not employing as many people making the crap that we buy. So if any portion of C, I, G, or X changes, that will shift the curve one way or another. So if consumer spending increases, AD increases. If consumer spending decreases, AD decreases. Same for investment, government spending, and imports or exports. Imports and exports is a little tricky though, because if exports increase, actually let me write this, and you write this too. If exports increase, that means AD increases. But remember, X is exports minus imports. So if the import category gets bigger, that will actually decrease our AD. So if imports increase, that leads to AD going down. So write that down somewhere on your notes and let's remember that because it will get a little bit tricky when we start thinking about net exports. Okay, so we need to practice here. What happens to AD and why do those things happen? So a boom in the stock market. If the stock market increases, that means people that have invested in stocks are making more money. They're making more income, and that's going to change how much we spend. So because of increased consumer spending, AD will also increase. Okay? All right, second one, widespread fear of recession. If people are afraid that their money isn't going to buy much, that they need to save money because they might lose their job, we're going to have a decrease in consumer spending. We could even have a decrease in investment spending because I'm not going to invest a bunch in my company. I want to save as much money as possible. That would make AD go down. Our demand for everything would go down because we're afraid we're going to lose money in a big old recession. Okay? Number 3, an increase in income of our biggest trading partner. So our biggest trading partner, let's say like, I don't know, Spain, I'm making up a country, they suddenly get more money. They're probably going to buy more of our stuff. So that means we would increase our exports and that would increase AD. Okay? Number 4, Americans make more money. Oh, if we make more money, honey, we're going to spend it. Increase consumer spending, and that causes AD to increase as well. Okay? And then the government builds a new interstate system. They are creating jobs, building this new interstate system. So we're going to increase government spending, and that leads to AD increasing as well. Okay? So all the things that we did, let's graph it. I'm going to explain each one again. Remember, a boom in the stock market means that we are increasing our consumer spending because everyone who's invested in stocks now has more money. If we increase consumer spending, we increase AD. What does that look like on a graph? If we increase AD, it shifts it to the right. Let me change colors here. Shifts it to the right. So we have to draw a new AD, label it AD1, and always, always put an arrow. And you see how we're not done describing the graph yet, right? When we increased AD, we went from this point of our GDP to this point of our GDP. So we want to tell our reader that, or the reader of the graph, Miss Keller, that, okay? So we would say our GDP, or you could put output. Either one is fine with me. Increases, and like we talked about earlier, if this increases, if we were making this much stuff and now we're making this much stuff, that means that we're employing more people to make more stuff. That would mean unemployment. If we're employing more people, unemployment is going down because we're making more people, we're hiring more people to make more stuff. All right, let's look at the next one. Widespread fear of recession. If you know that the economy's not going to do well soon, you're going to save your money. So consumer spending is going to go down. If you're a business owner and you know the economy's not going to do well soon, you're also going to stop investing a bunch in your business and try and save your money, okay? So C and I are decreasing. That means AD is going to decrease. So let's graph it. If AD decreases, it shifts to the left. Left is less. So draw a new AD line, label it AD1. Draw an arrow indicating which way it went. But we're not done yet. What else has changed? We started at making this much output. Now we're making, we started making this much output. Now we're making this much output. We decreased our output. So decrease output. Remember, you could also put decrease our GDP. And if we decrease output, we were making this much, now we're making this much. That means that we're not making as much. We don't need as many workers. People are probably going to be laid off. That's increase unemployment. All right, let's continue. Increase income of our biggest trading partner. We said this was probably exports, the export part of net exports, because if they're making more money, they're going to buy more of our stuff. So exports then increase, which leads to AD increasing. So let's put it on the graph. If AD increases, it shifts to the right. Draw a new AD curve, label it AD sub 1, and draw an arrow indicating which way it went. Okay, so it shifted from the left to the right. That was an increase. And as you can see here, we went from making like this much stuff to now this much stuff. So we have increased output as well. You could also put increase our GDP, same thing, okay? And if we increase output, we're making more stuff. We need to hire more people. If we're hiring more people, that decreases unemployment. All right. Americans make more money. If all of us make more money, we're going to increase our consumer spending. If we increase this, any part of AD, C plus I plus G plus X, we increase AD itself. So let's draw that. If we increase, we shift to the right. There we go, new line, label it AD sub 1, draw an arrow. And as you can see, we went from making this much stuff, our GDP, to now further along the line. So that means we increased output. If we increase output, we have to hire more people to make that stuff, so that decreases unemployment. Okay? All right, last one. The government builds a new interstate system. We decided this was government spending, and they're spending more money, so it increases, and that causes AD to then increase. So let's draw it. AD increasing shifts to the right, label it AD sub 1, put an arrow indicating which way it moved. If we were making this much stuff and now we're up to this much stuff level, that means our output or our GDP has also increased. If we're making more stuff, we have to hire more people, which decreases unemployment. All right. So, all of the things that I just told you are things that might happen naturally, or they just occur in the economy and they shifted AD or they changed AD. We're going to talk about fiscal policy now. And fiscal policy is when the government purposefully manipulates AD, changes part of AD to try and solve issues in the macroeconomy. And they're trying to solve issues like unemployment, recession, and inflation. Unemployment would be people don't have enough jobs, or there's not enough people with jobs. Recession would be we're not putting out enough stuff, the GDP is not increasing. And inflation would be things are too expensive. And those are issues that the government has the power to fix using fiscal policy. The government can manipulate mostly, for the most part, the C function and the G function. And how they can do that is manipulating consumer spending would be cutting or raising taxes, or passing government stimulus checks. So if we cut taxes, then people have more money in their pockets. They're going to go spend it. C increases. If we raise taxes, actually, let's write that down. If we cut taxes, C increases. If we raise taxes, C would decrease because people have less money. Or if we pass government stimulus checks, like more Social Security or more disability or more unemployment, or maybe like a COVID-19 stimulus check, the consumer spending would increase, okay? They can also manipulate the G function by either spending more government money, and spending more government money G would increase, or cutting back government spending, G would decrease, okay? And remember, if any part of AD increases or decreases, if any parts of AD, C, I, G, or X increase or decrease, the whole curve shifts. So this one, AD would increase here, AD would decrease here, AD would increase here, AD would decrease there. So when the government is trying to expand AD, they're trying to increase AD, it's called expansionary. And that's when they want to expand the economy and make it better to get us out of recession. And here's an example. Cut taxes, put money in people's pockets with stimulus checks or Social Security or unemployment or disability. and then more government spending, okay? Creating more jobs, creating more infrastructure, things like that. Okay, contractionary would be they're trying to decrease AD because the prices are too high. There's too much inflation, okay? And a way to do this would be to raise taxes, get money out of people's pockets in a sense, and then cutting government spending. So when they take these actions, they impact how much money the American government has. And sometimes we call that the federal budget, okay? So the federal budget is how much the government plans on spending. A balanced budget means that the taxes the government brings in, income taxes and sales taxes and things like that, is the same amount as the amount of money they spend on Social Security or unemployment checks or infrastructure or creating jobs or anything like that. This doesn't really happen very often. And so we have to learn other words to describe what they do. If the government spends more money, if they are expanding, if this is going to be expansionary, that adds to the federal debt and puts us in what is known as a deficit. So if it adds to the federal debt, we will be in deficit. And deficit means that we are spending more than what we are bringing in. Let's write that down. So deficit means that we are spending more than we are bringing in. And will you write that down on your paper too? Okay? So then, if we want to stop that and we want to balance the budget, if the government cuts back on spending, there might be a surplus of government funds. So if we cut back on spending, there could be a surplus. And these are all words that you need to know, which is why I'm highlighting and underlining them. And a surplus would mean that we are spending less than what we are bringing in. And remember, all of this is brought in by taxes. All right, so a deficit would mean that we are expanding our economy, but it adds to the debt. A surplus would be usually caused when we are doing contractionary fiscal policy. And we are trying to chip away at that debt, and our budget is more balanced, and we're bringing in more than what we're spending, okay? So let's take a look at an example here. So the government, first, are the following fiscal policy actions expansionary? Are we trying to increase AD? Expansionary would be increase AD, or contractionary would be decrease AD, okay? And how would they impact AD and the functions of AD? This is C, I, G, and X. Unemployment, surplus deficit, and the federal debt. Oh my goodness, we have so many things to think about. So for each question, we're going to go back to this bubble and think, did I answer all parts of the question? So number one, the government cuts personal income taxes and increases its own spending. So if they are cutting personal income taxes, they're wanting to put more money in people's pockets, okay? So what they're trying to do is increase C and increase its own spending, increase government spending. So in turn, this would lead to an increase in AD. If we are increasing AD, we are expansionary. So make sure you write expansionary somewhere. But we're not done yet. So if we're expanding the economy, what's going to happen to unemployment? Well, we need to make more stuff, so we need to hire more people. So a decrease in unemployment, which is a good thing, okay? If we are expanding the economy, though, that means we're spending more money. Are we going to go into surplus, where we are spending less than what we're taking in, or deficit, we're spending more than what we're taking in? Deficit is the answer. And what's that going to do to the federal debt? Are we going to add or subtract to the federal debt? We're going to increase debt, unfortunately, okay? All right, let's look at the next one. Government decreases Social Security payments. Sorry, that's not supposed to be there. The government decreases Social Security payments. So we're going to decrease government spending, And for people receiving Social Security, which is a large portion of America, we're going to decrease consumer spending. So all of that leads to a decrease in AD. And since we're decreasing AD, come back over here, decreasing AD means that we are more contractionary. So if we are contractionary, what is that going to do to unemployment? We're trying to lessen the economy. Well, if we're trying to lessen the economy, or lessen the amount of stuff that we're making in the economy, that's going to increase unemployment, which is a bad side effect of this, okay? If we are contracting the amount that the government is spending, though, what's that going to do for the debt and surplus or deficit? We might actually end up spending less than what we bring in because we're trying to cut back government payments. So this could be a surplus issue, and this would decrease our debt. Okay? Next one. The government invests in multiple infrastructure and building products. So the government creating more jobs. That's increased government spending, which leads to an increase in AD. For increasing AD, that means we are expansionary. And if we're expanding, we're creating more jobs, that's going to decrease unemployment. But somehow, these people have to be paid. That comes from the federal budget. So this is going to, we might end up spending more than what we bring in, which is called deficit. And the more deficit we have, the increased debt we have. Okay, last one. The government cuts the wages of government employees. They're cutting the wages of government employees. So government employees are making less and the government is saving more. That's going to decrease government spending. That's also going to decrease consumer spending, right? So we are trying to decrease AD here. And when we're trying to decrease AD, that means that we are doing contractionary fiscal policy. All right, and with contractionary fiscal policy, we're trying to decrease the amount of stuff we're making in America. That's actually going to increase unemployment, even if they're trying to bring down price level. But the positive part is we might end up spending less than what we bring in because we're saving some money. So that could put us into surplus and decrease the debt. All right. So let's graph them real quick. I know we explained everything over here, but let's go ahead and graph what those things might look like. So the government cuts personal income taxes and increases its own spending. Let's just very quickly review what we already said about this. We won't write it all out. But if it cuts personal income taxes, that means people are going to have less money in their pocket, decrease consumer spending, and people are going to have more money in their pocket, increase consumer spending, and also increase government spending would lead to an increase in AD. And if we increase AD, we move it to the right, label it AD sub 1, and do an arrow showing what happened. Now, we already explained over here what happened. Was it expansionary, unemployment, deficit, debt? Right here, we will write expansionary, though, or at least expand. Okay, let's do the second one. The government decreased Social Security payments. We decided that was decreased government spending, but also decreased consumer spending. So altogether, that leads to a decrease in AD. When we decrease AD, we shift it to the left. Left is less. Draw a new curve, label it AD sub 1, and draw an arrow indicating what happened. And since we are decreasing, this is contractionary fiscal policy. Okay, because the government is actively trying to do something to contract the economy, okay? Number 3, the government invests in multiple infrastructure building products. We said increase government spending because someone's got to pay them, but also increase consumer spending because those people are getting jobs. So if we're increasing both those things, that means we're increasing AD. If we increase AD, that means it's expansionary politics. No politics. Fiscal policy, expansionary. Okay, and if we increase AD, we shift it to the right. Label it AD sub 1 with an arrow. Okay, last one, the government cuts the wages of government employees. So we said, sad for them, decrease government spending, but also decrease consumer spending because people have less money. The government employs a ton of people. So we are decreasing AD, shift it to the left. Left is less. Label it AD sub 1 and draw an arrow for me. Remember, if we are decreasing, we are contracting the economy. Contractionary fiscal policy. Okay? All right. So let's look at this in real time, in a real world scenario, then we'll be done. So the following situations, what I'm sharing with you, actually happened in the spring of 2020 during the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. So think about AD, aggregate demand. All the goods and services that people want and need and will buy drastically went down when all of us had to be locked down in our homes. So think about all these scenarios. Think how they would affect C, I, G, and X and unemployment. And if it is a government scenario where the government is trying to fix something, is it expansionary or contractionary? And what would it do to the federal debt, surplus, and deficit? So some of these things are things that happen naturally, and some of them are things that the government did to try and fix the issues of the things that happened naturally during the COVID-19 pandemic that plunged us into somewhat of a recession, okay? So number one, COVID-19 slowed down businesses and thousands of people lost their jobs. This isn't fiscal policy. It's not the government doing something to try and fix it. It just happened. So if it slowed down business, that means people are spending less for their businesses. Decrease investment spending. People lose their jobs. They don't have as much money. Decrease consumer spending. All of this means that it's a decrease in AD. I keep writing the wrong thing. Decrease in AD. And when AD decreases, we're making less stuff. People are losing their jobs. That means we're going to have an increase of unemployment. And that's exactly what happened during COVID-19. Unemployment actually got up to 14.7% in April of 2020. Because the aggregate demand, the demand for all the goods and services in the United States went super way down when we were all locked up in our homes sitting around watching TV, okay? The Dow Jones, which is a measurement of stock market health, plummeted, okay? So if the stock market is not doing well, that means that people aren't getting returns on the stocks and bonds that they've invested in. They have less money. That decreases consumer spending. And a decrease in consumer spending leads to a decrease in aggregate demand. I did it again. Aggregate demand. And if we're making less stuff because aggregate demand decreases, that will increase unemployment. Okay? All right. Number 3, the lack of ventilators, which is a life-saving respiratory machine, pushed the government to invest in healthcare supplies and PPE. So in the middle of the pandemic, governments realized we don't have enough hospital beds in ICU. We don't have enough ventilators to help people breathe that have been heavily impacted by COVID-19 and are in the hospital on the brink of death. So we need to invest government money in those healthcare supplies, in hospitals and doctors, and also in PPE, which is personal protective equipment, like N95 masks, like face shields, like antibacterial scrubs that nurses wear, okay? So the government starts buying these things to try and stave off the hospital issues. And so this is an increase in government spending. And when we increase that one part of AD, we increase all of AD. So aggregate demand, because the government is buying tons and tons and tons of hospital supplies and PPE, actually increased a little bit during parts of the pandemic. And when aggregate demand increased, we needed those people, we need people to make those things, the PPE and the ventilators. Some businesses switched to making ventilators and masks, and then we had trouble finding other goods. So think about all the businesses like here in town, Wild Turkey and Four Roses. They stopped bottling whiskey and bourbon for a while and started bottling hand sanitizer instead. I think about my dad plays guitar. He couldn't find guitar strings in the middle of the pandemic because a bunch of the guitar string factories switched to making face masks during the pandemic because the government was paying them to do so. So we increased demand for those things, and in some cases we had decreased unemployment because all these factories were switching over to making PPE supported by grants from the government, and they needed to hire more people to make the things that we needed in the pandemic, like ventilators and masks and face shields and hand sanitizer. Okay? All right. So this actually was a fiscal policy decision. So the government made a fiscal policy decision to increase demand by increasing government spending. So this would be considered expansionary. Not only was it saving lives, creating ventilators and life-saving measures like that, but it was helping the economy recover from the awfulness that happened when unemployment got up to be a ridiculous amount. Okay? So they were trying to fix the economy. Well, if we're spending more money, what does that do to our debt? Our debt increases. And what's it going to do? Is it going to put us towards deficit where we're not bringing in as much, or surplus where we're bringing in more than we need? It's going to move us towards deficit. So our deficit increased. The government spent a lot of money during the pandemic, okay? Number 4, the CARES Act included stimulus checks to all Americans under a certain income. So if you were under a certain income, then you were able to make $1,200 per person in your household, per working age adult in your household. And then I think it was like $500 per child in your household. And this was the government's way to try and put money in people's pockets. So they are increasing government spending, but also we're getting stimulus checks out to people. So we're increasing consumer spending in the hopes to restart and jumpstart the economy. Both of those things would increase aggregate demand for things. And this is the government taking action. They knew we were plunging into a recession, so they passed this stimulus check, and it showed up in people's bank accounts, and the government spending money to try and re-stimulate the economy. That's why it's called a stimulus check. So this is expansionary. The government's trying to expand the economy to fix the recession issue. But if we're spending more money, our debt increases, and it moves us towards deficit, where we are spending more than we are bringing in taxes, especially because so many people were unemployed. They weren't even paying taxes. All right, number 5, the government lowers interest rates to try and stimulate business. That's why it was such a good deal during the pandemic to take out a loan or to buy a house or buy a car, because you could get awesome interest rates. And the hope was that people would invest and start businesses or buy more things for their business or take out loans to buy more things for their business to try and stimulate the economy, and also increase consumer spending. I'll buy a house, I'll buy a car, I'll take out a loan because interest rates were so fantastic. So both of those things lead to an increase in AD. And if the government's purposefully trying to increase AD, it is expansionary fiscal policy. Okay, but we can't just make that money appear out of somewhere. That just means that we are moving more and more and more towards debt. And if we're increasing our debt, if we're spending more and more and more, then that means that we are moving towards deficit, where we are spending more than what we're taking in. Oh yes, and I'm so sorry. I forgot on all of these right here, where we are expanding. All of these would decrease unemployment. And the reason being that if we are trying to expand the economy and we're moving AD to the right purposefully, they're making fiscal policy actions to try and shift it to the right. They're trying to stimulate business, create more goods. If we're creating more goods, we have to hire more people. They're also trying to fix this disaster of one of the highest unemployment rates since the Great Depression, almost 100 years ago. So the government was purposefully trying to decrease unemployment. All right. Thank you guys so much.